Chicago, Illinois. February 14th, 1931. Al Capone sat in the back room of the Lexington Hotel on South Michigan Avenue, his fortress, his kingdom, the place where he controlled an empire that generated $100 million annually through bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and violence that had made Chicago the most dangerous city in America. Capone was 32 years old, was at the absolute peak of his power, had survived the St. Valentine's Day massacre 2 years earlier that eliminated his last serious rivals and controlled Chicago so completely that politicians, police, and judges operated at his command. But on this cold February morning, Capone faced a problem that terrified him more than any rival gangster, more than any federal investigation, more than any threat of violence. The problem was simple and devastating. Someone close to him, someone in his inner circle, someone who knew his secrets, was talking to the federal government. And Capone didn't know who. If you're watching this story about loyalty, betrayal, and the most dangerous secret in 1930s Chicago, drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from, and subscribe so you never miss the dark stories that shaped the American underworld. The threat had become clear 3 days earlier, on February 11th, when Capone's lawyer, Edward O'Hare, delivered news that no mob boss wanted to hear. The federal government was building a tax evasion case against Capone. Not a bootlegging case, not a murder case, not charges related to the violent crimes everyone knew Capone committed but couldn't prove. A tax evasion case. The government had discovered that Capone had earned millions of dollars between 1925 and 1929, but had never filed income tax returns, had never reported his illegal earnings, had operated as though tax laws didn't apply to him. The charges were serious enough to send Capone to federal prison for a decade or more. But what terrified Capone wasn't the charges themselves. What terrified him was how the government knew the specific details of his income, the exact amounts he'd earned from specific operations, the financial information that should have been known only to Capone's closest associates. Someone inside Capone's organization was feeding information to federal agents. Someone Capone trusted had betrayed him, and that betrayal could destroy everything Capone had built. O'Hare explained that the government's case was built on evidence that could only have come from inside Capone's operation. Financial records that Capone thought had been destroyed. Testimony from witnesses who knew details about cash transactions that weren't documented anywhere. Information about how Capone laundered money through legitimate businesses. The level of detail was too specific, too accurate to have come from surveillance or from informants outside the organization. This was inside information. Someone close to Capone was cooperating with the enemy. Capone spent the next 2 days in a state of paranoia that his associates had never seen before. He trusted almost no one, suspected everyone, saw potential betrayal in every conversation and every gesture. His inner circle consisted of perhaps 15 people. His top lieutenants, who ran his gambling operations, his bootlegging distribution, his prostitution rackets, his accountants, who managed his money, and his lawyers, who protected him from prosecution, his drivers and bodyguards, who were with him constantly, who knew his schedule, who heard his conversations, who had access to information that could destroy him if shared with federal agents. Any one of these 15 people could be the traitor. Any one of them could be the source feeding information to the government. But there was one person Capone had never suspected. One man whose loyalty had seemed absolutely certain. One associate who'd been so close to Capone for so many years that the idea of betrayal seemed impossible. His name was William Shadow Jackson, and he was about to become the most dangerous man in Chicago. Shadow Jackson was 38 years old in February 1931. He'd been born in Mississippi in 1893, had moved to Chicago during the Great Migration in 1917, searching for work and for escape from the brutal racism of the Jim Crow South. Jackson found work on Chicago's South Side, took whatever jobs were available to colored men in a segregated city, worked as a porter, a janitor, a factory worker. But Jackson had abilities that went beyond manual labor. He was intelligent, observant, loyal to people who treated him fairly, and absolutely fearless in situations that would terrify most men. In 1923, Jackson had intervened when he witnessed 3 men attempting to rob someone outside a speakeasy on 22nd Street. Jackson didn't know the victim was connected to Al Capone's organization. He just saw an injustice and acted, fighting off the robbers despite being outnumbered, saving the victim's life at considerable risk to his own. That victim reported the incident to his boss, and 2 days later, Shadow Jackson received an offer that would change his life. Al Capone wanted to meet him. Capone was impressed by Jackson's courage, by his willingness to fight when he could have walked away, by the loyalty he'd shown to a stranger. Capone offered Jackson a job, not as a runner or a low-level associate, but as a bodyguard. As someone who would be with Capone constantly, would protect him from threats, would be trusted with Capone's safety and with the information that came from being present during Capone's most sensitive conversations. The offer was extraordinary for a colored man in 1923 Chicago. The Italian mafia didn't hire Negroes for positions of trust, didn't bring outsiders into their inner circles, didn't share power or information with people who weren't Italian. But Al Capone had a pragmatic streak that other mob bosses lacked. He cared about competence more than ethnicity. If someone was loyal, if someone was effective, if someone could be trusted, Capone would work with them regardless of their background. And Shadow Jackson had proven himself to be all 3: loyal, effective, trustworthy. For 8 years, from 1923 to 1931, Shadow Jackson served as one of Al Capone's personal bodyguards. He was with Capone constantly, drove him to meetings, stood guard outside rooms where Capone conducted business, was present during conversations where criminal operations were planned and where violence was ordered. Jackson heard everything, knew everyone in Capone's organization, understood how the empire functioned, how money flowed, how decisions were made, how enemies were eliminated. Jackson knew secrets that could destroy Capone if revealed to law enforcement. And for 8 years, Jackson had kept those secrets, had maintained absolute loyalty, had proven himself trustworthy in ways that even some of Capone's Italian associates hadn't. But in February 1931, Al Capone began to suspect that Shadow Jackson's loyalty might not be as absolute as he'd believed, and that suspicion would lead to a series of events that would shock Chicago and would demonstrate exactly how dangerous it was to know Al Capone's secrets. The suspicion began on February 12th, the day after Capone learned about the federal tax case. Capone was reviewing the list of people who had access to the financial information the government possessed: his accountants, his top lieutenants, his lawyers, and his bodyguards, who were present during conversations where money was discussed, who overheard details that weren't supposed to be shared outside the organization. Capone's other bodyguards were Italian, were connected to him through family or through long criminal associations that created bonds of loyalty that went beyond employment. But Shadow Jackson was different. He was colored. He wasn't connected to Capone through ethnic loyalty or through family. His loyalty was based entirely on the job, on the money Capone paid him, on the trust that had developed over 8 years. And Capone began to wonder whether that loyalty could be broken, whether Jackson, facing pressure from federal agents, might choose cooperation over loyalty, whether the government had offered Jackson something, immunity from prosecution, or money, or protection, that was valuable enough to make betrayal worth the risk. Capone called a meeting with his top lieutenants on the evening of February 12th. Frank Nitti, his enforcer; Jake Guzik, his financial manager; Tony Accardo, one of his most trusted associates. Capone explained his suspicion, that someone in the organization was talking to federal agents, that the traitor had to be someone with access to detailed financial information, that the list of suspects was short, and that Shadow Jackson, despite 8 years of loyal service, had to be considered a possibility. Nitty's response was immediate. We should kill him. Tonight. There's even a chance he's the informant. We can't risk letting him continue. He knows too much. If he's talking to the feds, he can destroy all of us. But Guzik disagreed. Shadow's been loyal for 8 years. We have no evidence he's the traitor. If we kill him based on suspicion and we're wrong, we've murdered a loyal man, and we still have the real informant operating inside the organization. We need to be certain before we act. Capone sat in silence, considering both arguments. The safe play was to eliminate anyone who might be a threat, but the smart play was to identify the actual traitor before acting. Capone made a decision that would determine Shadow Jackson's fate. We test him. We give Shadow information that only he hears, specific details that aren't true, but that would be valuable to federal agents if they believed them. Then we watch to see if that false information appears in the government's case. If it does, we know Shadow's the informant, and then we deal with him. This is where the story gets darker. If you're still watching, comment below what city you're from and hit subscribe, because what happens next will shock you. Over the next 5 days, Al Capone executed the most sophisticated loyalty test in Chicago mob history. On February 13th, Capone had a conversation with Shadow Jackson in the back of the car, while Jackson was driving him to a meeting. Capone mentioned, casually, that he was planning to move $500,000 in cash from a warehouse on West Roosevelt Road to a bank in Cicero on February 18th. The information was false. There was no money at that warehouse. There was no planned transfer. But if Shadow was feeding information to federal agents, if he reported this conversation, the government would show up at the warehouse on February 18th, expecting to intercept a major cash transfer. And Capone would know that Shadow was the traitor. February 18th arrived. Capone had associates watching the warehouse on West Roosevelt Road. At 2 p.m., exactly when Capone had mentioned the transfer would occur, 3 cars pulled up outside the warehouse. Federal agents. They surrounded the building, prepared to raid it, clearly expecting to find the $500,000 cash transfer that Capone had mentioned to Shadow Jackson 5 days earlier. But the warehouse was empty. There was no money, no transfer, nothing illegal occurring. The federal agents searched for 2 hours, found nothing, and left frustrated and confused. Al Capone now had confirmation. Shadow Jackson was the informant, had been reporting Capone's conversations to federal agents, had betrayed 8 years of trust, had violated the loyalty that Capone had relied upon, had become the greatest threat to Capone's empire. And Capone's response would be swift and brutal, and would send a message about what happened to informants, regardless of how long they'd served or how trusted they'd been. On the evening of February 18th, Shadow Jackson received a message asking him to come to the Lexington Hotel at midnight. The message said Capone wanted to discuss security arrangements for an upcoming trip to Florida. Jackson suspected nothing. These late-night meetings were common. He'd attended dozens of them over 8 years. He arrived at the Lexington at 11:55 p.m., took the elevator to the 4th floor, where Capone's private rooms were located, knocked on the door, and was admitted by Tony Accardo. The room was dark, except for a single lamp in the corner. Al Capone sat behind a desk. Frank Nitti stood by the door. Jake Guzik sat in a chair to the side. And Shadow Jackson understood immediately that this wasn't a routine meeting. This was something else. Something dangerous. "Sit down, Shadow," Capone said quietly. "We need to talk." Jackson sat, his mind racing, trying to understand what was happening, whether his cooperation with federal agents had been discovered, whether he was about to die in this room. Capone leaned forward. I want you to tell me about the warehouse on West Roosevelt Road, about the $500,000 transfer I mentioned to you 5 days ago, about why federal agents showed up today expecting to find that money. Jackson's face remained expressionless, but inside he was calculating, trying to determine how much Capone knew, whether there was any possibility of denial, whether confession might save his life, or whether he was already dead regardless of what he said. Mr. Capone, Jackson began carefully. I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't spoken to any federal agents. I've been loyal to you for 8 years. Whatever happened at that warehouse, I had nothing to do with it. Capone smiled, not a friendly smile, a cold smile that contained no warmth or mercy. Shadow, I've known you for 8 years. I've trusted you with my life. You've been closer to me than most of my Italian associates. You've heard things that could send me to prison for life. And I always believed you were loyal, that you'd never betray me. But someone's been feeding information to the government. Someone knew details that only my inner circle knew. And when I tested you, when I gave you false information that only you heard, federal agents showed up exactly where I said they'd be. Capone stood up, walked around the desk, stood directly in front of Jackson. So I'm going to ask you one time, are you working with the federal government? Are you the informant who's been betraying me? Jackson knew that lying was pointless. Capone had evidence, had set a trap, and Jackson had walked into it. The only question was whether truth might save his life or whether he was already condemned. Yes, Jackson said quietly. I've been talking to federal agents. They approached me 6 months ago. Offered me immunity from prosecution and money if I'd provide information about your operations. I refused at first, but they kept pressuring me. Said I'd go to prison if I didn't cooperate. Said they'd charge me as an accessory to murders I'd witnessed. I had a choice between helping them or spending the rest of my life in prison. So I chose to help them. Why? Capone asked, his voice still quiet but now containing rage underneath. I paid you well, protected you, trusted you. Why betray me? Jackson looked directly at Capone. Because I'm a Negro in a white man's organization. Because no matter how loyal I was, no matter how long I served, I'd never be family to you. I'd never be anything more than the colored bodyguard. And when the government offered me a way out, offered me immunity and money and protection, I took it. I'm sorry, Mr. Capone, but I chose survival over loyalty. Capone stared at Jackson for a long moment. Then he nodded to Frank Nitti. Nitti stepped forward, pulled out a .38 revolver, and shot Shadow Jackson 3 times in the chest. Jackson fell from the chair, bleeding, dying, but still conscious. Capone knelt beside him. You should have stayed loyal, Shadow. Loyalty is the only thing that matters in this world. You betrayed that, and now you pay the price. Shadow Jackson died on the floor of that hotel room at 12:17 a.m. on February 19th, 1931. His body was found the next morning in an alley on the south side, dumped like garbage, with a note pinned to his chest that said, "Informants die." Before we finish this story, if you made it this far, drop a comment telling us what country you're watching from. And subscribe, because the dark history of organized crime has stories that will keep you up at night. But here's what Al Capone didn't know. Here's the twist that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Shadow Jackson wasn't the only informant in Capone's organization. The real source of the government's information was Jake Guzik, Capone's trusted financial manager, who'd been cooperating with federal agents for over a year. Guzik had encouraged Capone to suspect Jackson, had helped design the loyalty test, had pushed for Jackson's execution, all to deflect suspicion from himself. And Guzik's information would be what ultimately convicted Al Capone of tax evasion in October 1931, sending him to federal prison for 11 years. Shadow Jackson had told the truth when he confessed. He had been talking to federal agents. But the information he'd provided was minor, peripheral details that didn't significantly help the government's case. The real damage, the detailed financial records that convicted Capone, came from Guzik. But Jackson died for a betrayal that was real but minor, while Guzik lived and continued providing information that destroyed Capone's empire. The irony was devastating. Capone had killed one of the few people in his organization whose loyalty had been genuine for most of 8 years, whose betrayal had been reluctant and limited, whose information hadn't significantly damaged Capone's interests. And Capone had trusted the man who was actually destroying him, had relied on Guzik's advice about who to suspect and who to trust, had never questioned whether his closest financial advisor might be the real traitor. Al Capone was convicted of tax evasion on October 17, 1931, 8 months after Shadow Jackson's execution. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, served 7.5 years, was released in 1939 with his health destroyed by syphilis, and died in 1947 at age 48. When asked in his final years whether he regretted anything from his criminal career, Capone mentioned Shadow Jackson, said he'd killed a man who'd been mostly loyal, who'd betrayed him only under extreme pressure, who'd deserved better than death in a hotel room. Said he'd trusted the wrong people and suspected the wrong people, and that mistake had cost him everything. Jake Guzik continued working in organized crime until his death in 1956, never facing prosecution, never paying a price for the betrayal that had destroyed Al Capone. Protected by the federal agents he'd cooperated with, and by the loyalty Capone had mistakenly extended to him until the very end. And Shadow Jackson? He was buried in an unmarked grave on the South Side, forgotten by everyone except the few people who'd known him, remembered only as the colored bodyguard who'd known too much and had paid the price. His story became a legend in Chicago's underworld, a cautionary tale about the cost of knowing secrets, about the impossibility of loyalty when survival demands betrayal, about how the most dangerous position in organized crime isn't being an enemy, it's being close enough to know everything. That's the story of the man Al Capone trusted, the bodyguard who knew everything, the informant who died for a betrayal that was real but wasn't the one that mattered, and the real traitor who lived and prospered while an innocent man, or at least a mostly innocent man, paid the ultimate price. Chicago in 1931 was a city where loyalty meant nothing when survival meant everything, where trust was a luxury that could get you killed, where the people closest to you were often the most dangerous. Shadow Jackson learned that lesson too late, and Al Capone never learned it at all.